When I was 14, I lived in a very rural area. As teens often do, I got very bored in my small town, and to alleviate my boredom, my friends and I would routinely explore the surrounding areas and go on long day hikes. There are two instances I can remember of being very creeped out on one of our expeditions. The first time was in the summer. My two friends and I decided to hike across several dozens of kilometers. We of course prepared adequately, as any group of 14-year-olds would. We had water and a bag of jerky between the three of us. Naturally, we got very hungry, as the jerky ran out quickly. To combat this, we decided to cut through the back roads and the farmlands, so that we could get to the highway faster and thusly to food. After about an hour of hungry hiking, we came upon a little village that was all gated up and surrounded by brambles. This itself isn't too creepy. What was creepy was the fact that just inside the gate was a mountain of cattle corpses. There seriously would have at least been 3 dozen bodies in the pile. As kids, we were sufficiently spooked. As an adult, I think a logical reason for Death Mountain may have been that the herd were diseased, and this was an easy way to quarantine. The second time was with the same friends, but we were a few years older. On our adventure, we decided to walk through railroad tracks to gather old rail spikes so that we could sell them to the scrapper. After a few grueling hours of hiking and carrying increasingly heavier backpacks, we happened upon a house. It was very secluded, but from outside it didn't look abandoned. Curiosity and fatigue got the better of us. We dropped our bags and went in exploring. We initially just wanted some water, but we found the front door wide open. Outside, there was a lot of construction machinery, so we thought that perhaps they were doing/finishing some work inside. We called out but received no reply. So with recklessness, we decided to effectively break and enter. This place turned out to be a dump. It looked like a crack house. Old garbage and food everywhere. We assumed no one lived there after all. So what do? We decide to snoop around. And we were poking around the ground floor when we heard what sounded like footsteps on the second floor. We called out but no answer was given. My one friend decides to be brave and go up to check it out. As he got to the stairs, he calls out again. Nothing. So he starts up the stairs, and I shit you not, as his foot hit the first step, we heard a music box go off. Alright, kind of creepy. But then we heard a child's giggle from above us. We noped out of there pretty quickly and ran home. We even forgot our backpacks. A little over a year ago, I spent the summer backpacking Southeast Asia. For reference, I am a college-aged female, and most of my traveling was done alone. Around 3 weeks into my trip, I was in Chiang Mai, Thailand, where I stayed for a few days before heading further into the mountains. I had joined up an organized group at that point, which had pre-booked the hotel that we were staying at. That afternoon, I went to go drop off my backpack in my room, where I was staying alone, and the minute I walked in, something felt very, very wrong. It's a feeling that I don't even know how to describe. I immediately felt as if I were being watched, and I made a point to put my head down and avoid looking at the mirrors that were in the room, out of fear of something or someone watching me. As time went on, I realized that the more time I spent in the room, the worse it would affect my thoughts and emotions. That night, I kept seeing a vision of a woman dressed in all white with black hair, covering her face, standing in my room. I didn't even close my eyes whilst I was showering out of fear of her standing there when I opened my eyes. I could have sworn I wasn't alone in the room, and that the other presence was malicious. Also, that night, I was walking back out of the bathroom, and I glanced at the glass bottles of water that were set out. In my head, a whole scenario played out of me breaking the glass water bottle on the table and using it to slip both my wrists. I'd never had any thoughts like that, and so I was extremely distressed and scared. Next morning, I got up early and left my hotel room to do some sightseeing. About an hour in, I felt extremely nauseous and lightheaded, afraid I was going to pass out on the street. I went back to my hotel room and lay down to get some rest. As soon as I was back in there, an overwhelming sense of dread hit me. I got the idea in my head that I was going to die that day. Everything in my mind was telling me that once I closed my eyes, I would never wake again. I kept telling myself that I was probably just ill or dehydrated, so I kept drinking water and telling myself I was going to be okay. I was still awake, but I shut my eyes, and immediately I had a vision that demons were grasping onto my ankles and tried to pull me into hell. At that moment I was praying and screaming in my head. In my vision, something grabbed my hand and pulled me up, and then I passed out for several hours. When I awoke, I immediately left my hotel room and felt fine. But that night when I came back, I was having the same vision of the woman and feeling like I wasn't alone. We left the next morning, and nothing remotely similar has happened to me ever since. But I've always been left wondering what that experience could have meant. Also, we stayed in the hotel one more time a week later, and I was in a different room, and everything felt completely normal. One thing's for certain, I'm glad I didn't have to stay again in room 241. My cousin is with the Forest Service in Montana/Wyoming, and I decided to go up there with her to literally test the waters. She does hydrology and has to ride out to the middle of nowhere to test streams and snow runoffs to ensure no contaminants. So I thought that sounded fun and wanted to go do a bit of a tour with her. So we were going to have a camp out there for 2 nights. So we packed all our gear into our saddlebags and started out. The first day and night were amazing. Beautiful scenery and amazing air quality. It really is so peaceful out there. I love that area, and I wish I could go up there more often. We started out on the second day, and my cousin said, "Do you want to see something weird?" Of course, I said yes, and she led me to a bit of a side journey into this tiny little ravine. We ended up traveling around 2 hours out of our way from the actual path. At the very end of this fold in the land, she dismounts and tells me to get off my horse. We tie them up in this gorgeous little clearing, and she tells me to follow this tiny wildlife path and bring our little rechargeable radios. It's one of those that you can plug in or wind up. It also acts as a lantern if you really need to, but it kills the batteries very quickly. I do, and out in the middle of nowhere, there is a huge coil of wire sticking out from the ground. The wire itself was not weirdly large, like someone buried a transmission wire, but small, like a 10 to 12 gauge wiring for a house. It trailed off into the bush and trees, so naturally I decided to follow the damn thing out of curiosity. My cousin trails behind me as I do, and this wire, after coming up straight from the ground, is strung across limbs of trees, then back off into the ground, and it snakes around rocks, and finally dead ends into an outlet. The outlet is mounted on the side of a desk. It looks like a school teacher's desk from when I was growing up, with a metal base and a pseudo wood/plastic top thing. No chair, no building, no nothing. Just this outlet and a desk. I'm staring, confused as hell. Why is there a desk in the middle of a forest? And then my cousin takes the radio, pulls out the cord and plugs it into the outlet. And then it just lit up and started blaring static. The wire was being fed from somewhere. Now, the place where we were had absolutely no road access, and no buildings for many, many miles, with no other people around, and yet there was a live outlet. Weird as shit. Around 9 PM last night here in Florida, I was hanging out with my buddy in my backyard, just sitting on a picnic table adjacent to his house on some woods with his baby monitor. We were in the middle of a conversation. As I was speaking, I began to feel the typical ringing in your ears. The sensation that everybody gets from time to time. I was not shocked, as I truly believed it was normal and probably being produced by my body, not heard as an external stimuli. Then quickly, about 10 seconds later, the sound intensifies as I was still speaking. The ringing became loud, louder than my own voice. I can feel it almost shaking my brain. It's extremely high-pitched and my ears aren't usually the best at picking up high frequencies. I begin to panic. What the hell? Am I going deaf right now? It was the first thing that I thought of. Just as I was about to express my fear of going suddenly deaf to my friend. "Bro, do you hear that?" he says. It sort of sounded like it was coming from the woods, but was very hard to pinpoint. We sat confused, looking at each other, basically being bothered by this ringing. House alarm? Bugging the woods? Satellite? Whatever it was, any louder, and it would have made me deaf for real. It was unlike any noise, frequency, pitch, whatever that I'd ever heard. It literally shook my brain and bones, as if it entered me. The strangest thing about the ordeal was that my buddy's baby monitor turned off during the ringing. Sounds totally crazy, but it did. Absolutely no external sound besides the ringing. It eventually subsided slowly, until it completely went away, and the lullaby from the monitor came back on. Lasted probably no more than 45 seconds. A definitive what the hell moment for me and my buddy. We just sat there contemplating a dozen things that it could have been. But I guess it remains an unresolved phenomenon. Has anyone else experienced the hum? I was out for a long run, probably around about 12 miles on dirt roads through Iowa farmland. Plenty of abandoned barns and old buildings alongside it. As I'm running, I see this figure up ahead walking on the road. It's an old man, fairly well groomed. I could have compared him to anyone. He looked a little bit like Jerry Sandusky, but greyer, and with more black in the corners of his mouth than eyes. He was wearing a white sweatsuit and carrying a plastic bag over one shoulder. It looked heavy and full. The man smiled at me, and I smiled back, even though physically I was distancing myself as far away as possible from him. As I passed him, I began to feel dizzy and nauseous. His presence just felt so wrong. His smile was off. I actually had to swallow back vomit that had just began to climb my throat. My adrenaline had gone up, and my pulse was hammering. When I looked back after a couple of meters from distance, he was gone. I have no way to explain this. My life has been turned upside down and backwards many times. so many times in fact, that I wonder why the twists seem to take the shape that it has so repetitively, with the last several years culminating in several life changes that started when I was a child. Introspection set in, and I began to really sift through the years seeking answers, or at the very least, some kind of clues. Nearly going blind will do that to you. Nearly dying several times didn't seem to be the ticket. But those are tales for another time. The differences in my life from others I know has been so dramatic that in the growing darkness of my sight, I began to try and piece things together. I was always different. Going back into my memories, the differences begin right away. No one else I know can remember their first steps, getting their diapers changed, the distaste for the feel of plastic pants over their underpants as they are potty trained, the first feel and silence of being sat in a depression of snow at 10 or 11 months. I could read well before entering kindergarten because of my mother's teachings, since she labelled everything with the same name of the thing in our shared bedroom, even in my crib. Yes, I can clearly remember those times, even the abuses my parents and elder siblings sent my way, though those didn't ramp in intensity until after I was back home and turned 6 years old. Forgive me, I'm getting slightly ahead of myself, but with reason, as you will eventually find out. As to the blindness that I avoided, which you've undoubtedly been asking yourself about, trauma-induced cataracts from concussive impacts to my head, from beatings and car accidents. No, not when I was driving. These happened when I was a child, and before the law and normal use of seatbelts stepped in to protect us from ourselves. Now, needless to say, this is all completely true. I know you'll all wonder if this is the case. As I am a child of two nations, born in the US, this means a large amount of my cultural background goes into the sum of my parts, with a Cuban father and a mother from England. You can see what an amazing contrast there would be between the two parts of my family. The differences are so vast, with one half being very spiritual, Santeria being a large part of the religious makeup of the Cuban side, and on the other is the Celtic influence of my mother's family, with deep ties to the old faiths of the islands of the United Kingdom, all the way back to the old religion of pagans and druids. As a baby, I never knew how protected I was by my tías, which means aunts in Spanish, and their diligence to keep the house that we lived in safe from the other world that they knew was there, and feared terrifically in fact. Constant blessings, use of camphor, holy water, and cleansing with incense happened all the time. They kept my dreams untroubled, and I feared the dark only because I could not see. Eventually we moved, and the home I would grow up in did not have any of those benefits, as I began to see things in the darkness most easily. Aside from feeling things, when I was near something spiritually active at a distance, I could see things too. Take for example my Uncle Mickey and his wife Olga. As a little child, we'd go there all the time because Auntie Olga was my godmother. Her mother lived with them, but had her own room, and was very old and in not the best of health. But she had an aura about her that said that she was kindly, and wished that she could do more when my brothers and sisters and I came to visit than just sit in her room or lie in bed. Sometimes she'd be too exhausted to get out of bed, and we would have to play quietly on the other side of the house on the covered porch. I had a habit of wandering off and going places that I was told not to go, following feelings that seemed to draw me. In fact, Sometimes I would wander blocks away from home or from parks, scaring my family silly. I would go to my tia Olga's mother's room, and as I'd walk in, a man standing next to her bed would look up and smile at me most of the time. My memory of him is hazy now, as it is of her, but I remember dark but warm eyes, steely grey hair swept back and slicked back down to keep it neat with a light blue guayabera. He was thick in the upper body, muscular, but not overly so. I couldn't see his lower body, since he was on the other side of the bed. She would look away from him to me, following his gaze, and see me standing in the doorway. I would greet her, "Hola, señora," and then my Uncle Mickey said something from behind me to get my attention. I'd look, to turn to see what he said, and when I'd look back, the figure, the man that I had just seen, would be gone. There was no place for him to go, I should point out, and no one else lived there since my cousin, Michael, had moved out some years before. Keep in mind these events happened when I was 4. No one would ever tell me who that was. No one wanted to even mention it. The fact is, it only started whispers between adults about the events. Fearfully whispered discussions amongst them. Discussions that I was not even allowed to think on eavesdropping on. It wasn't long after that my Aunt Olga passed away. I never found out who the man was in the room with her, but I was assuming it was someone very close to her, for the simple fact that I never felt menaced by what I saw, and the room felt brighter as she passed. My mother's relations had come to visit us for a little while, and I do believe I even got to see my great Aunt Lily more than once in the US. My mother's father, Granddad, had been setting aside money since she'd left home to have her come home, either to stay or for a long visit, and this money he'd saved up from quitting smoking. Funnily enough, he'd been saving for so long that the amount had grown high enough for us all to come visit them during the summer. My father had to work, so he couldn't come with us. His job was very demanding, and our talismans, given to us by the Cuban side of our family, were not allowed to come with us, and remained in a box back home, despite our loud protestations. My mother was most insistent, as she was embarrassed by them. My time in England was not boring. We walked everywhere, or took buses or trains, and we were dragged to every mall, castle, monument and palace of interest that my mother could think of. This is in direct contrast to the part of Los Angeles where we lived, that required a car and a long trip to get anywhere meaningful. It was a shock, to say the very least. All of this whilst travelling between homes of my granddad and Nanny, that's my grandmother, and my Aunt Sonia and Aunt Celia in various places around the country. When we first went to stay with our Aunt Celia, it was a bit of a shock. Upon first stepping through the front door and removing our Wellington boots, I noticed that the air was thick and cold. To the left of the large front door was a toilet behind a closed door under a large staircase with a banister. My eyes were drawn to it as we were led inside by my aunt, distracted with talking to my mother about her coming wedding. Another reason for our presence, so my mother would be there for her younger sister's wedding. The cold stopped as we got to the 3rd stair and turned right onto the landing and proceeded up the stairs. Now the air was just thick and unwelcoming. We were shown to our rooms, the ones that we would be sleeping in. Us children. It was across the hall from Celia's room, and next to my mother's room. I kept looking at the door to my aunt's room, a pulsing sensation in my ears and pressing on my chest. So distracted was I, that I didn't even notice I was being asked something by my mother, as she ushered me into the room to unpack. Celia smiled at me, as she opened the door to her room. Something about getting into her regular clothing, now that she was not travelling anymore that day. I looked past her into the room, with eyes wide, and the feeling of dread growing. She saw my curiosity. "What is it, Sean?" she asked. I looked past her shoulder into the room. Past her. I could see her bed and nothing else. I looked back at her as she entered the room, and then walked out of sight to the right, towards what I would later learn was the walk-in wardrobe. During this, she crossed my view of the bed, and when it was clear enough again, I saw something that chilled me to the marrow, and the pressure came back enough to make me gasp. There, in the bed, now, sat an old woman in a sleeping cap and nightgown that looked like someone out of the 18th century. Her hair was grey and tied up in the cap. Her skin was parched and wrinkled. She couldn't have been older than 70. The woman was sitting there in the bed, looking in the direction that Celia had walked out of my field of view. Then slowly she turned to look at the doorway. It seemed at the time that she was turning her head at the sound of my gasp. Her eyes were angry and unwelcoming. At that moment my sister and mother walked past, breaking my line of sight. As they walked past to go down the stairs to get the rest of their suitcases and unpack, I stood frozen, my brother asking me what was wrong as they walked by. And after they'd passed, the woman was nowhere to be seen. I told no adult, nor my sister, as I remembered the response seeing things like this had gotten me in the past. I confided in my brother only, and he told me that he hadn't seen anything. He proceeded to tell my mother and sister all about it. During the rest of our stay, I kept my eyes averted from her room, so that I wouldn't have to risk seeing that woman again, and refused to use the upstairs bathroom, and I'd have to pass her and risk seeing or feeling her presence again. My grandparents' flat had no oppressive feel to it, but there was a ghost all the same. A figure would walk into the bedroom where my brother and I slept, look around, and then leave. He was dressed in an odd helmet, shaped like a brimmed soup bowl, with a chain strap and a strange heavy jacket, with leather buckles that looked water resistant. I could never see his feet, as it was always too dark in the room. As the man entered, he always seemed to bring light with him, almost as if he glowed mildly. Otherwise I would not have been able to see much of him in the middle of the night. I have no idea if I woke each time he came, but when I did wake, it was usually prefaced by that feeling that I thought my mother had just walked up to check in on my brother and I, which she did now and again. It's important to note that my mother had a fear for graveyards. She's been tracing our family tree for ages, and this meant that we were usually dragged to find headstones with her maiden name on it. One particular grave near my grandfather's flat was apparently where my great-grandparents were buried. The graveyards were never empty of people walking through and looking around. We'd be there many times, clearing the weeds and bracken from the shared grave of my great-grandparents and placing flowers there before I asked my mother why so many people were milling about. Her answer was, "I don't know, Sean, what people?" She asked as she looked around, finally paying attention to what I asked her. As the youngest in the family, I'm rarely listened to, and almost everything I say was dismissed outright or ignored. Never before had I wished that my mother had ignored my question. I looked up at the people who were walking amongst the graves and pointed at them. Specifically, I pointed to a girl with reddish hair tied up in a pink ribbon, that was wearing a light sweater and a dress that dropped to her knees. We were in our rain gear, and this girl and all the others were not. They were all in different attire. They looked dressy, such as suits and dresses, whilst others were dressed casually. Some looked like they were dressed in the current clothing style. Some were considerably older. I had not noticed it from before that moment. Further, not a single one of them had an umbrella or rain gear of any kind. It was at that moment that I realized two things. Ghosts can appear in the daylight and outside, because as a child, I assumed that being outside and being daytime meant I was safe from them. But I was wrong. These ghosts had suddenly become aware of me, all of them, as if they were discomforted at scaring me. They all turned to look at me with an impassive expression on their faces, except for the girl I pointed at, and then each of them turned away and faded from sight. It was almost as if they had pulled a screen in front of themselves, or stepped from one room to another by changing the focus of their attention. The girl with the reddish hair and the pink ribbon, she didn't disappear. Instead, she smiled and stayed fairly close, listening to our conversation and watching, all in a completely non-threatening manner. No one seemed to notice her throughout the whole time we were there, which I was eager to cut as short as possible. Threatening or not, I was leery of her and unwilling to let her be close, always keeping my mother between us. I have no idea who she was, and I was too scared to find out or even try to talk to her. Funnily enough, the church for that graveyard is where my Aunt Cecilia was married that summer. That's where my grandfather was buried when he died of a massive heart attack in his flat in August, just after my mother's birthday. And no, I never saw him again. His spirit, despite staying in the flat for many more days, never came to me. Nor, might I add, did the man in the helmet ever appear for me again. I'm sure most of this seems innocent as far from dangerous for you guys, but you have to see it from the point of view of a 5-year-old child. Not only that, you'd have to understand that before this, I'd never encountered so many so often. I'd only ever seen things swirling or faces peeking out of my closet. But there was so much to be seen in England, ever more so. Though we stayed with the relations, we never went to stay with my Uncle Billy. We did, however, get some chance to visit distant relations, distant in both lineage and in mileage. One set was in Scotland, and with nothing spiritually noteworthy to say, except that I felt safe, almost as if I were back in my old home, as though something was protecting me. But the scariest experience I had was visiting our cousins Glenys and Roy. They're a nice couple, with a home that had a past, that had no clear answer for. At my aunt's wedding, we were told by my Aunt Celia about the ghost of the bed. It was an antagonistic spirit that menaced with only male adults that slept in the bedroom, shaking them with shrieks and attacking them in other more painful ways. They look into the history of the house, and it went back about 200 years, being one of the oldest homes in Wales, with a history rich and mostly lost through time. Of course, Roy had only been told these things and never tried to sleep there himself. A friend of his had tried and left in the middle of the night, never to return. No one stepped forward with more information as to why the spirit did what it did, whether it was male or female, or what had brought its darkness into the home in the first place. All this was recounted by Celia with dark glee, as she looked onto the paranormal. Terrified at what I might end up seeing, the trip to Wales was long and arduous, as we had to stay on the train for several hours and make a few changes and then ride a bus. Before it was all over, I had been menaced by my sister and brother with the idea of ghosts in the house. Ghosts they didn't believe in or could see. Menaced with the idea of being put into a bedroom I was so scared of sleeping in. You know that that's how it is with children. We're going to put you in there, Sean. We're going to make you sleep upstairs with the ghost. They'd torment me, them wailing like ghosts, holding their hands up, making poses like a revenant out for human blood. I'd wail and run, scared out of my wits, already at the knowledge that I was going to be near it, certain in fact, despite my mother's claims that they wouldn't, and that they wouldn't make me sleep in that accursed room. I passed out on the last bus, despite trying to stay awake in order to make sure I was able to make certain that I was not put in the wrong room. My siblings had a nasty habit that once they knew about the ghosts I could see, they'd lock me in closets just to hear me shrieking in the dark, and it was sometimes not void of others. I was scared that they would force me into the room and make me face their threats. My fears were in vain, as they never did go through with it. I awoke slowly and softly to find myself in a bed already, despite the fact that I could tell by the ambient light that it was still daytime. It was also sunny outside. I was covered in a thick blanket that almost felt as heavy as one of those lead coats they throw on you when you get an X-ray at the dentist's office. It was warm and comfortable, and for several seconds I realized where I was. Then terror blossomed in my chest as my heart began to hammer against my little ribcage. I sat up, struggling under the weight of the blanket. Sitting up, I looked around the room. The bed was old, and I could hear the spring shafts as I did. The headboard was metal, rather like the kind that you see in old movies of hospitals, but it was much larger and wider. It seemed so large to me at the time, disproportionately big for a child of my small stature. To my right was a window within the pull-down, shade drawn from the lintel to within the inch of the sill. I could tell the window was open because of the way the shade moved slightly now and then from the air flowing around it, causing the sun that was coming in to vary in intensity. Under the window was a low chest of drawers made of dark stained wood. It looked antique and sturdy, and to my left was a tall dresser that was at least 4 feet high but with no mirror on it, also made of dark stained wood, that made me feel frightened for some reason by the lack of mirror. Directly besides the bed on the left was a nightstand made of lighter wood with a single drawer in it. I heard the sound of my family downstairs laughing loudly at something. It seemed to come up to me, as if to mock me, teasing me, almost like I were put there on purpose or to test me, to torture me and to expose my fears. But after all, to them it was not real. It was explained away as imagination. How many times by my mother since coming to England? I'd lost count, and I could hear my brother and sister laughing at something, the low voice of Roy interjecting something now and again between the bursts of laughter. Well, I thought, I'll show them. I'll get away. I'll call them stupid and mean for trying to scare me and laugh about me, always picking on me, the smallest of the family, the butt of their insults and tortures. How many times had they locked me in a closet, with things reaching for me in the dark, or in a room with ghosts that could see me as well as I could see them, all in the name of helping me get over my fears. Tears began tracing down my face as I thought of this, but now they intensified from drops to streams that blurred my sight as my horror and feeling of betrayal intensified. My cheeks were soaked and stung slightly from the hot, salty tears. I moved to get up, but paused. I felt it then. Through the whole of my body I felt it, like suddenly I was deep underwater. The pressure was intense, and almost like a nightmare in intensity. Like drowning out of water, sinking deeper and deeper every second. The crushing feeling, growing tighter and tighter around me, pressing on my little chest. My shoulders creaked as they were forced into my body, and my wrists were crushed into my stomach, almost as if a gigantic hand was gripping me. Looking back now, I have no idea how I survived. I tried to move, but my arms could not defend whatever it was that held me. Another chorus of laughter from underneath the door drew my attention downwards, and I could see the gap beneath the door, with the light from the hallway illuminating a small patch of wooden carpet and the edge of the rug on which the bed sat on. Fighting to draw enough breath to scream for my mother, all I could do was sip the little air at the time into my lungs and let it out. I tried to make noise, little gasps for help, "Mummy," and calling for my sister and brother. But looking back, they couldn't have been louder than a whimper. They were far from where I was, and downstairs, and they would probably ignore me if they could, as they usually did. I felt betrayed, as well as terrified beyond comprehension, but it wasn't even close to what I was in for. A sound, distant but persistent and strange, reached my ears, and then in the silence of the room, it didn't echo. It seemed as though the sound was sucked away as soon as each sound finished. It grew steadily louder, and by the time I could tell it was getting closer, the grip hadn't lessened on me, and in fact, began to push down so my little legs were bent at painful angles on the bed. The springs squeaked in response to my downwards pressure into the bed, and then I heard my mother say, "I think I heard Sean upstairs. I'll check on him later," going to step out for a cigarette, and it trailed off, as she must have gone outside. The sound of the door opening and closing, and then silence. They had all stepped outside, and I could now hear the sound of my brother and sister laughing distantly from the open window to my right. My right hip protested, the pain of being crushed in the semi-sitting position with my right leg splayed out on the right, and my left extended in front of me. The noise I'd heard now seemed emboldened at being alone in the house. I could finally tell, at last, what it sounded like. It was like a groan, only it sounded like a person groaning whilst inhaling rather than exhaling. And it didn't stop this time. It was inhaling and making the sound, getting louder and louder and closer, but I couldn't see from where. My eyes were now rolling around my sockets, searching every corner of the room to see if I could find the source of the sound, all whilst my mind was crying for my mother, my tears now soaking through the neck of my polo shirt in front of my chest. The groan stopped for an instant, and then began again, louder this time, as I sensed it was very near. I looked down at the doorway. Something had attracted my attention despite the new burning pain in my chest. What attracted my gaze was the light from under the doorway, which was slowly going out. It was being blotted out, as if by shadows or something moving over the source of the left of the door to cover the light. Eventually the light was absorbed by a solid line of shadow, and I knew it could not have been a person. A person could not make this kind of completely eclipsing shadow over the light. There would be a shape of feet or legs or something. The sound was now just outside the wooden door, louder than before, and something more. It was not a single groan. It was the sound of several people. No, a chorus of them. And it sounded now almost like a painful gasping into air-starved lungs. Only it never paused to finish, taking the perpetual inward breath. The groan didn't sound like it stemmed from pain. No. It sounded almost like an engine getting going, as if it was drawing something it wanted into it. The louder it got, the more I hurt at the pressure of the crushing sensation. As I watched, the shadow over the light was taken by something darker, and it began to slide under the door. It was darker and fuller than before. I could see an amorphous mass sliding underneath the door that was darker than midnight, and it entered the room. The sunlight that came in and around the shade in the window grew dimmer. The pressure on my chest surged angrily as I was suddenly flung back in the bed and banged my head against the slated metal headboard, which in turn smashed the wall. The sound of it, though, should have been loud, but it sounded like a muffled clunk to me, as if the sound had been sucked away or muffled underwater or with a pillow. My head, now dazed from the collision, was too loopy and weak from lack of oxygen to appreciate the reality that I could now breathe. All thoughts of escape had long gone, and I wanted my mother to come and rescue me, to drive it off and protect me, to enfold me in her arms. But I realized that this would not happen. Despite her promises, she put me here and allowed me to be in there, and either way, she didn't really care about me. Blarily turning my gaze downwards, I watched the foot of the bed for signs as I prayed. Let me die fast so it can't touch me or take me. Please just let me die. I was so scared that all my limbs had gone cold from shock. The groaning started at an all-new intensity, revving upwards in the chorus of sounds, and my eyes grew wider in terror as the dark mass now surged upwards in the air as if standing. And it didn't even stop. It stood all spread out as if oozing into the air, sucking the warmth and oxygen from the room, the light growing dimmer and darker as I laid there, numbly panting in ultimate terror. My thighs grew hot as my urine burst free into my jeans and ran out of my pants and onto the bedding. The groaning changed, as if almost overjoyed, a triumphant tone, and it spread to the right and left like bat wings, reaching around to engulf me in its wicked hungry embrace. Please, 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 please. I realized I was panting, begging as my tears blurred my vision. The mass moved to the bed, and it slowly began to engulf me. All I heard was the groaning. It filled my ears, and then seemed to crawl into my head and echo there. A fresh weave of tears made it all, so I saw a blur and the cold feeling in all my limbs. My head propped at a strange angle against the headboard, forcing me to watch as it closed in. The anticipation of its icy touch on my already cold skin repulsed me, and I began to shiver uncontrollably. Then, just before I knew it was going to touch me, my vision cleared, and I could see that it was about to touch my shoulders and embrace me. The noise it made surged one last time, bestial sounds of the predator about to make a kill. But it was all suddenly blotted out of the intense, white-hot agony on the top of my head. A burning, watery feeling that was very intense happened at the top of my head. Wave upon wave of heat. An agony, like the top of my head had just been sawed open with a welding torch. But it didn't fade, and it was as if the room filled up with blinding white light, so bright that my eyes had automatically been drawn to slits to protect them. The whole room was filled with it, except for the Stygian patch of nightmare before me on the bed. It had halted in mid-reach and was now illuminated completely. I could somehow tell it was in pain. Now I could see it entirely, and I wished to heavens I never did. The thing was made up of the faces, images and bodies, all black against black but easily discernible, all caught mid-scream or wail or groan, in some position of pain or writhing, contorted in agony, moving slowly within the mass, undulating to the tone of their own trapped misfortune, all moulded together into a thin sheet of ultimate darkness, pressed into a fabric of utter damnation. This thing wanted me to be part of it. I just knew it. And though what it was may have once been human and had the potential for love and mercy, all that was left was the desire to add more to its flock of tortured souls. I have realized since then that the faces I saw, the darkness that it was all merely a covering for the real force behind it, the thing hiding behind the curtain of souls. The light in the room intensified, and the burn to my scalp lessened at last, allowing me to move slightly. The mass leapt off the bed and seemed to be sucked under the door, all while thrashing left and right. It passed into the hallway, and the groaning sound receded as sounds from the outside and the light returned to the room. I could hear my siblings playing and my mother talking to Glynis about something. The light was dimming finally, and I looked around the room to see where it was coming from, weakly swiveling my head to try and find the glimpse of the source. But it was against the wall. Nothing should have been able to be behind me, and that's exactly where it always seemed to be. My strength, what little the light had imparted, was flooding out of me rapidly. The thing was gone, and I wanted to escape and get out of the room. Now, reaching my right arm to the left edge of the bed, I tried to grab onto it and pull myself out. I failed as the last of the light and the burning sensation fled me. I tumbled out of bed, heading onto the floor. I don't remember hitting the floor. In fact, I don't remember what happened for the next 3 days. My next memories were that, heading away from the train station in her town and on our way to her house. It took a long time to piece together the story, but here's what I know. They thought I'd fallen out of bed after peeing on it on the first day. I'd gotten up, cleaned myself off, and my mother found me half-clothed trying to change the sheets. They fed us supper. I ate heartily at the wonderful food that Glynis had cooked, and then we'd gone to bed. Throughout it all, I acted normally. That was that, but I remembered none of it. Perhaps it was the shock. What I do remember was eating the Welsh cakes that Glynis had made herself. Even made me a snack to eat. That my brother didn't like them, and that my sister was trying to stay in shape for gymnastics. You can say I'm delusional, or that I'm not sane. You can say anything you like. I was never more scared than I was that day. Because I was a little boy, but I know what I saw. In case you're wondering, did it stay in that house? No. In fact, Glynis and Roy said that after we were there, during a visit to the US before they moved to New Zealand, someone across the street had died, and they figured it had gone to follow the person. Roy slept in the room once to make sure nothing had happened. I had a different take on things, but never spoke to them of what I knew. Wasn't worthwhile telling them that the thing followed me and made my life hell. Guilt never solved anything. I don't know what it was, I didn't care to name it. Give it a name if you need one, I couldn't care less. What I do care about is from that day, my life went different. It couldn't get to me, so my family turned dark. I don't know if it was the thing that wouldn't let the people sleep, or the tale that we were told. What I care about is that my family went from being what it was, to cruel and vicious. After we came home, the darkness got to my father. I know this because he beat me until I was unable to control my body function, and even gave me a concussion. All on Christmas Day of 1977. Merry Christmas. And why? Because I accidentally opened the wrong present. Car accidents followed. My father began to drive angry, regularly. I nearly went through a windshield with a full backpack at age 9. The only thing stopping me was the fact that the window wasn't made to shatter. 1970s construction. Gotta love it. My mother began to regularly dish out damage to me because my siblings would blame me for things and wanted to see me get punished. My siblings began to use me as a whipping boy when they were upset. It made me feel worthless, and I withdrew from their presence as much as I could. This seemed to make them more antagonistic. My brother acted as if he were always being edged on to find anything that he could to get away with hitting me on the head with. This even included putting a metal nut on his finger and lashing out at my head when no one was looking, especially the top of my head. Complaining to my mother was useless. The only solace I had in this time came from my Cuban grandfather Papacito. He would protect me when I was near him. I was safest from all of them. Naturally, this dark thing made sure he was gone as soon as possible. My parents divorced suddenly, and my mother drove off my aunts and grandparents. Despite the fact that they lived next door to us, she found a way to make them move. After that point, cataracts started to form, and though I could see spiritual things somewhat as dim outlines, I could not see them as clearly as before. No longer did they look like normal people. Now I have ocular implants, and I can see as well as any of you can see. Mostly. A few more laser treatments, and no more cataracts. And my ability to see ghosts is as it was when I was 5. I know this because I was shopping one day after my first surgery, and left my eye unbandaged 2 days prior. A little girl ran past me, giggling, and knocked over produce as I watched, then ran through a cart loaded with produce as if it wasn't there. The person stocking the produce, a little dour-looking Hispanic lady, never looked up to follow her. She only humphed in annoyance and picked up the peppers, putting them back where they belonged. I asked if she saw the girl, and she gave me a puzzled look. You may be wondering, does misfortune follow me still? And are my steps dodged by this thing? No. Thankfully it's gone now, and with good reason I might add. But that, as they say, is another story. I was a forest fire lookout in the summers during college. I went weeks between seeing another human sometimes. Some of the first things I witnessed or heard whilst doing the job are just flat unexplained. The one that sticks out in my mind was laying in bed and watching a strange light move through the trees. Figured it was a car headlights, until it went vertically up into the air and just hung there for 30 minutes. Just sitting 20 or 30 miles away, parallel with my tower. It was an elevation of 7,000 feet. I watched it until it dipped back below the tree line and never saw it again. At the time I was super creeped out, but chalked it up to another one of the dozen things that I could have seen that I hadn't explained before and no one would believe. But the next day, another lookout called me on the radio, asking if I'd seen the same light. He was much closer but on the other side of it. He said from his perspective, after it dipped below the trees, it landed in an area he knew to be a lake that was only accessible by hiking or horseback. It stood out in my mind because it was the only strange light that summer that we couldn't explain away by either planes, balloons, or tricks of the light from cars. I have since wondered if it were a drone, but this was before they were really obtainable to hobbyists, and have never seen one with lights that could be seen from as bright as 20 miles away, or one that could hover in place for about 30 minutes around then. This is where things get weird. The lake where the lights settled down into, according to the other lookout, is a pretty popular spot for fishing trout. That summer, the lake developed some form of algae, or just something, and all the fish died off. They stocked it with fish, and they just kept on dying. No one remembers this happening before that summer that we saw the light land in it. It was like this for the next 2 or 3 months that I came back as a lookout. No fish could live in it. Just another weird story from my early 20s as a fire lookout. As long as my friend's little girl could talk, she would always mention her dark friend. They assumed that this was an imaginary friend, or some name that she heard in a story in daycare. It went on for many months. As she began to improve her speaking, she'd talk about her dark friend more and more. Recently, my buddy heard her jabbering over the monitor one night, and he heard her call her dark friend Miranda. Again, thinking this was a friend from daycare, they moved on. But after finding out that daycare didn't have a Miranda, they realized they didn't know anyone called that name. It's not common at the moment, and she really has no reason to know it. They did a bit of research. It didn't take them long to find out that a woman called Miranda had died in the house that they were living in. She wasn't the person who owned the home before them. It had been an owner or two back. But her name was Miranda, and she died inside the house. They pulled up the obituary and called their daughter. Without any prompting, they simply asked her, "Hey Army, do you know who this is?" And she got excited and said, "That's my dark friend." It's a suburban house, less than 10 years old, so not something that you'd figure for a haunting. But this was the most legitimate evidence I've ever heard. They are a super normal family, and I'd never expect them to lie about anything like this. It makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up every time I think about it. When I was a teenager, I used to go out camping by myself. I had a spot that I liked that was across a few fences from my grandparents' house out in the middle of nowhere. One of the places I cut through was a pasture full of cattle. Around cattle, especially cattle unfamiliar to me, I tried to be very careful not to spook them, but otherwise cows are pretty easygoing. This was about a mile from my grandparents' house, and probably about 2 away from my destination. The last time I did this, I slipped through the fence to find the cattle already freaked out. They were insanely agitated about something that I wasn't aware of, so I stayed well clear of them as I went through the pasture. I had a good time camping that night and packed up next morning. As I went back to the pasture, however, there was this ridiculously bad smell. It smelled like a skunk had fought with something in a fertilizer barrel full of shit, and the barrel had broken open. It was awful. I tried to look around for the cows to make sure that there weren't going to be any surprises, to not see them at all. They were just gone. There were some bushes and trees, so I thought that maybe they were just out of sight. I keep walking through the place to go home, and the smell is so bad that I set my stuff down at the little fence line and decide to investigate. Well, I found all the cows. All of them were shot and ripped apart. Somebody had carefully shot them in the head with a bolt gun and eviscerated all of them. They had also dug them all into a shallow ravine and piled up the bodies. It was horrible. I hightailed it out of there to get back to my gear, and my stuff was gone. As in, I set it right here on this rock, and it's not within eyeshot. A quick glance showed me that there wasn't anything ripped or fallen out, or something or someone had picked it up when I was 200 yards away for less than 5 minutes. I think Usain Bolt would not have been able to catch me on my way home. I never heard anything else about those cows, but I did not go back camping to that old spot again. Around 2010, I was doing Weight Watchers. I got into this groove where I'd go on walks all the time. Nighttime walking was nothing different. I'd lived with my dad in a neighborhood across the street from a Catholic church. I grabbed my iPod and ran out the door. I would take a route that would go along the side of a church, around the back out of my neighborhood, in basically a large circle. So it's around 9 p.m. I was walking back home, and I decided that it would be fine to sit on the swings in the church playground, to cool off and listen to some tunes. I might have been there for about 6 or 7 minutes, and I got off the swings and turned towards the cemetery. I looked up for what was only a moment, and 2 shadowy figures came running towards me. As a tradition with most people who have experienced this kind of thing, you're in shock, not really able to move. The 2 shadows ran past me, and when I turned the other way to get a good look at them, there was nothing there. Just a single parking lot light around 200 yards away. I stuck around for a few more minutes looking at my surroundings. I tried debunking right away, looking at any possible light sources that could have maybe been in motion, causing some kind of shadow scattering effect when cast on an object. After that encounter, I stopped walking at night, and haven't seen anything like that since.